When you drive to get to that place and you finally get there, you'll realize that it wasn't what you thought it was.
I really just had myself, and what was like left with myself was so much pain and suffering.
Yeah.
I had nothing to lose, so why not try? Welcome back to another episode of the New Rules podcast. It's your girl, Breezy, and we are so excited to be talking with you today.
I'm excited to be here. How you doing?
I'm doing well. To start us off, I want to do something a little bit different.
Let's do it.
Something that we talk about very frequently is 5 minutes of real. It's a practice that we encourage people, a lot of our executives, just leaders that we work with when they wake up in the morning, to have 5 minutes of real or dump the box. So where are you today?
I think that a little bit kind of ambivalent. I think that there's something I'm dealing with where part of me is like, you're okay, it's just what it is. And then there's another part of you that's like, you have a piece about the other part of you. You're a little freaked out about it, but that's kind of where I'm at. So I'm kind of in this idea of ambivalence. And then on top of that, just, a lot of other stuff that's kind of coming down the pipeline. So when I get in these types of moments and modes, I get very just steady. I'm not too high. I'm not too low. I'm just kind of right there in the middle.
Where do you feel like is your greatest challenge, and what's the thing that you're hoping for?
I think my greatest challenge right now at this point in my life and in this current moment is like my health, because I think for so long, like I was kind of one of those things that I just neglected for a long time. You just go, drive. But you hit to a certain point in life where your body's just like, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. And so I think that's one of my greatest challenges of like really over the last year, I've been working, just getting that in order and in line. And so it's like once you make one step or one hurdle, you get over it, then there's another one that's there. And so I think that's the biggest thing right now. Is probably the biggest challenge that I'm having right now.
What's the thing that you're hoping for?
Right now, I think what I'm hoping for is like my family. Just hoping for the future, like me and my wife, with my children, their futures, things like that. There's big transitions happening. Our son's going to be going to college, this upcoming, matter of fact, starting in the summer. Then we have a daughter, Brooklyn, she's going to be going, a year after that. And then you'll have Peyton, who'll be going into high school. So they're all just these transitions. I think my wife with her business, like she's ended kind of a decade of 10 years with it. So she has this whole new thing coming up. So I'll be interested to see how that goes.
That's exciting. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
What about you?
Yeah,
let's go. I'm not going to be the only one on the book today.
So for me, I think ambivalence is a very crucial part of the human experience. I think the answer to any question is usually always both and.
Yeah.
So I value that we kind of take the time to put words to both. Interesting enough, a little bit similar, I think in a different vein as far as like the challenge. Yesterday we kind of did this with our staff as well. For me, like, I'm just afraid. Like I'm afraid a lot. That's something you've been talking about too. Like, but for me, one of the definitely driving emotions in my life is typically fear. Specifically, I've had like pretty crucial like back injuries. I'm like 24 with the body of a retired construction worker.
Yes.
And like honestly, like there's hope like for the treatment and how it works out. Obviously, like I'm incredibly young, but there's like parts of me where the fear is like, oh, like what if I can't have kids, or like what if I can't like play with my kids, like things like that is where my mind goes, which is really scary. And also learning like as a young, like I'm 24 and I'm learning like, oh, I'm like paying penance for the ways that I didn't take care of my bodies whenever I was like 16, not my bodies, singular, my body. Whenever I was 16, 17 doing some pretty high intensity sports. But I will say on the flip side of that, because again, the ambivalence, I think there's always a hope tied to it or something that you're learning that is crucial. For me, I would say that honestly, and this is more related to like my faith journey, I am very grateful that as a young girl, I've been through like very strenuous, like emotional experiences that are incredibly and like deeply painful, like both emotionally and physically. And it has been so painful. Like, I mean, the hardest thing I've done in my life so far. But from it, I have learned like to trust God deeper. And I know that's, something people kind of like put on a placard and put out there, but it really is true. Like for me, even in this next phase, as I move into some of the physical stuff, I, at the same time, even though I'm scared, I like genuinely have no doubt that like God is going to take care of me in whatever way that looks like. I genuinely feel like I can trust the process, and I can embrace the process and know what it feels like to be present in the midst of really painful stuff and still hope for the future. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. You said something about the idea of like, even in all this pain, you were like hopeful. Mm-hmm. Like, and I know you said you have a lot of hope in God and things like that, but like, cause there's a lot of young people who, who listen to like our podcast, and a lot of times pain is seen as such a negative thing. And, and I know your story, that a lot of it's, yours, it's a very like, super tragic, very horrific type of stuff. But how can you say that now? Like, how can you say like, oh, like I have hope? I mean, cause like that's the last thing that a lot of people are going to say when they talk about like levels of pain, especially the level of trauma you went through.
Yeah. Honestly, and this isn't the answer that I think most people want, but you have to get to the point where you have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
I think when you're still in that phase where you're like, I have all these different things that I can try, and I can pretend they're helping, and I can kind of fool myself in the ways that they might be impacting like my soul or my mind or my body. I think that you just kind of get lost in like space for a little bit. Whereas for me, what kind of started the process, it was like I genuinely had nothing to lose. Like things could not get worse. Yeah. It's not like I had, at the time in the beginning, like major intimate relationships. It's not like I had a, major tie to my family. Like I really just had myself, and what was like left with myself was so much pain and suffering. Yeah. That I had nothing to lose, so why not try? Yeah. It was, and if these next 2 to 3 years that I commit to a process of like just unearthing really painful stuff, if it doesn't work, it's not worse off than where I started. Yeah. The only risk is that it could get better, and if it doesn't get better, then the risk is that the hope that I had is kind of being crushed, and that's not nearly as painful.
Is what you went through.
As the place where I was.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course. I think to anybody who's listening, trust the process.
Yeah, the process that's what it's all about. I think so many times we're so obsessed with like getting somewhere instead of actually you just miss being in the moment and what being in the moment does.
Yeah. I don't think that there has ever been a time in my life, and again, the grand scheme of things, it's a little amount of time, so maybe ask me in 20 years. And I'd love to hear your thought on this, but there hasn't been a time where I've like really focused on the place where I am, and it hasn't benefited me in the long run. Yeah. Even if I wanted to be somewhere else, or even if I didn't like something, or even if it was like deeply painful. 5 years later, there hasn't been a time where I haven't gotten something from it by sticking with it.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that it is being present and being in the moment is one of the most important things you can do, because when you're present, you're in the moment, you're going to learn. You learn so much, you become more aware. Even if it's stuff where you're like, man, you're hoping for something, or you are dealing with stuff, you learn in that moment. You learn like kind of like what are your hindrances? A lot of times when we're waiting for something, we have hindrances that like hold us back. And so when you're present, you can actually learn from that. When you're present, you can see what pressure actually produces inside of you. When you're present, you can actually, even be aware of those other people who are around you. So actually the process of being present moment, I would agree with you. It never really ever gets like, I've never like regretted it. Even stuff that didn't work out the way I thought it should, it ultimately worked out later. It worked out in a better way later down the road. So I would agree with you.
What do you think puts you in the position to experience life and end up in a better place than where you started? Because I think a lot of the times we expect life to be it's kind of like life owes us. Like we want it to be the good thing that changes us into the person that we desire to be. Yeah. But that's definitely not the case. It requires some level, not even some level, like fully involvement from the self.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, you have to understand what you're actually trying to become, and why. Because I think so many times the things that we're trying to become, usually we're running from something. We're trying to protect ourselves from something, the thing, our future self that we want it to be. And so I think what you have to realize is that can't be the thing that drives you, because if you do get there, sometimes you'll never get there because you may not have the skill set to get there. The other thing that comes out of that is that when you drive to get to that place and you finally get there, you'll realize that it wasn't what you thought it was. It won't protect you. It won't save you. It won't let you experience that pain less. And so I think the way that you have to be intentional about moving forward in life is to actually ask yourself, what am I trying to, what type of man or woman am I trying to become? And then I think that allows you to move through, and then you start becoming intentional about that part. It's not really about the accolades or the material things you get, but it's like, what type of person do you want to be? What type of characteristics do you want people to say, to explain, or to, when they mention your name, they're like, oh, that person, man, they have high character, there's integrity, they're kind, they're a risk taker, whatever it is. What characteristics do you want? That's the stuff you should be working for, and I think that's what keeps us moving in the right direction.
A characteristic that you embody that has deeply impacted my life is development, and empowerment. And that's a lot of what we want to focus on today. To start us off, where did you learn the importance of development?
I think just growing up, I was fortunate to have really good coaches, who actually spent time with me, who actually invested in me. I saw my father, who's a coach, do the same thing, where he spent so much time. The reason why he got into coaching was to help young men. And so it's always been a part of my life to see that. And I recognized very early on that I was not going to get somewhere unless I had somebody else helping me. And when you fast forward from that point, then I started realizing once I had the ability to help somebody else, how important it was going to be for me to do that, because someone had done that for me. And so I just saw it my entire life of just people investing in others, and I saw it personally how it made me better as well.
What about development draws you into it and kind of list it as an essential part of leadership?
Because I believe that to be a leader, you have to have followers, you have to have followership. And I believe that you can't build that unless you actually invest into people. People will follow your title for a second, but people actually follow leaders who help invest into them. And so I think if you are, especially in our current moment, I believe one of the key characteristics of any great leader is the ability to actually lead people to actually be able to develop people. The ability to develop people actually gives you more credibility when it comes to your leadership.
Development is all fun and games until you entrust people in positions that if it doesn't work out, it could really impact you. It could impact your image, if you're a business, your financials, all of that kind of stuff. Yep. And so there really is a major risk in that. Can you tell a story about a time where, because we've been together since I was 17, working together, and 18. And so can you tell about a time where you put me in something and you're like, oh, I don't know if this is going to work out, but you trusted it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't work out.
Yeah. I think when we started doing our agency, it was a risk because it was a new place I was walking into, because I had never been into this consulting. I'd help people in a consulting kind of individually, kind of just ad hoc, but I never said, okay, we're going to actually go build a company. And so I was going into new territory. The second thing is that, at that current time, I think when we started doing this, you were 21. And so it was one of those things to where, I was going to turn that over to help, for us to go build it. And I knew I couldn't do it alone. So when we did that, it was one of those things to where I, had to take a risk to step out. But I also believe that you had proven up to that point that whatever I gave you, you were faithful to do it, and you actually produced from it. And so I thought this was the next step for you. So it was a risk, but also it just wasn't just a random, hey, let me just throw this out there for her to do it. It was I think you had done enough to show that you could carry that next part. But it's always a risk when you give somebody something that's going to be that next step.
What are the qualities that you look for, and how do you know that they're there? Because like that time phase was not glamorous.
Yeah.
Like what I was mentioning in the beginning of this podcast, like a lot of the time I was an emotional wreck, and I was like fighting to compartmentalize, you know, so many different areas of life and to be able to show up. And so you did really take a risk, and you put me in places based off of who you believed that I could be, and like a trust and like rising to the occasion rather than where I was.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is that I always say this and I'll keep repeating, it's like you were actually coachable. Coachable, teachable is the number one attribute I look for in anybody. And that was one thing that you were. The second thing about you was that there's a toughness about you. I think and you had the ability to want to compete. I think that when you're having to learn something and you're getting thrown into something, I see that somebody have the ability to compete. Now, sometimes, you know, some people they weren't trained in that. So you try to see, is there like characteristics? Are they willing to fight, even though they don't have like a natural like ability, not such a natural ability, but they weren't trained in that, and you're actually having to help them. But that's the second thing. And I think the third thing that I look for is really, you know, are you passionate about it? Are you willing to, and for you, it wasn't so much the consulting you were passionate about, but like you said, you're like, hey, whatever you're doing, whatever you're trying to create, I want to help you do that. And so that was the passion. So I think those three things are very important for me as I look at, are you coachable, teachable? Do you have toughness about you? And really, do you have like a passion for whatever it is that we're actually working on and doing?
For the people who don't naturally have a competitive nature, and especially in this current cultural moment where those that are younger like are really struggling to understand why we like work the way that we do, kind of as a nation, and lacking meaning in kind of like the work of your hands. What is the story that you tell them in order to help them understand why it's important to have levels of value and what it is that you produce?
Well, I think the first thing is like when you have to work for something, it means more when you get it. And so that's the number one thing I tell people. Why you should work at a level is because when you get that thing, it just means more. I mean, I think at some point people have done something, whether if it was like, you know, if they had, I mean, it could be something as simple like, man, they waited for a pair of shoes and they were up at like, you know, back in the day, they were up at 4:00 in the morning camping out or to get this pair of shoes.
Black Friday back in the day.
Or like the new iPhone or something like that. It's like, man, and you stood in line and you did all that, you know, or if you go to an amusement park and you like, you know, you sit there for hours to get this one ride. When you finally get on the ride, you enjoy it a lot more because you went through something to get there. I think that we don't value things as much because we don't actually fight and work for those things. And so that's why I tell people, man, like you'll value it, you'll take care of it, and then you'll use whatever that thing is that you got, you'll use it even better when you actually are able to when you work at it and you compete at it and you are willing to, you know, put your hands in the dirt for it.
Can you tell a story about a time where you made room for somebody to grow and they didn't end up showing up in the way that you wanted them to? And what did recovery look like from that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got probably more stories of people who didn't than those who did. And I'll just talk about it in general. What ends up happening in that is the recovery. Well, first of all, it was always hard for me when I was younger because I saw who they could be. And one thing I made mistakes early on. I gave people way too much responsibility before they were able to handle that responsibility. I would give them responsibility based off who I knew they could be versus who they were at that current time. And the recovery normally is that normally when after recover, usually when that happens, there becomes a breakdown in a relationship. So like that's the part you lose there. The other thing that you lose is there's probably a financial loss that was there that happens. And then the other thing as a leader, which you have to gain back, you start to question yourself. You start to question, man, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I can't develop people. Maybe I saw this wrong. And so so the fallout is, man, you have to do the autopsy to see what type of leader you are and to see if you really have the chops to do it. It makes you face reality a lot of times.
Can you talk a little bit more about the skills that it takes for a leader to empower?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I think most leaders don't evaluate the people they're actually leading. So what will happen is that we naturally just have this expectation for someone to already be at a place, versus it being someone where we're like, well, we expect them to already be somewhere, and then we hold them to that standard where it's going to take them a lot longer to get there. So I think the first thing, you got to be a good evaluator for where that person's at, and actually can you look at what their pathway is going to be. The second thing is that I think as you evaluate, then you have to look at what are their greatest skills, and then what are the weakest skills. But in the weakest skills, in that weak skill area, what's the main area they're going to need to get upgraded in so they can actually get there? So I would say that all that evaluation is a huge, huge part of that. I think the second thing is that you have to have perspective of that, how long it's going to take, and realize, looking at it, kind of what we've been talking about, be in the moment instead of trying to get someone there. I think the third thing besides perspective, I think you have to be able to manage your own anxiety, because most leaders, when they start pushing really fast, or they even kind of back away, a lot of times it's because that's how they deal with their emotions. And so that your emotions bleed, and I think when you're not doing that, your emotions end up impacting others as you lead in that type of way.
What do you do in the moments where maybe you're frustrated at something else, or something emotional might be going on, or maybe you had conflict with somebody that you're leading, and your tendency is to back away?
Yep.
What do you do whenever you're in that situation?
Is I always say you have to sow opposite of what you feel. So when I want to back away, a lot of times what I try to do now is lean into that. So if I'm like, all right, forget it, I just don't want to deal with them, then I just kind of disconnect. I really try to force myself to lean in more to what they have going on. I try to force myself to push more to to push into the conversation, to push into the conflict, to push into the issue, so that we can actually move forward. Because I'm not doing my part or my job as a leader if I just disconnect from somebody because of how it makes me feel. Now, I'm all about, man, if you need to take a step back to kind of gather yourself, if you're naturally quick-tempered, but if you're not, and you're naturally someone who goes the other way, it is incredibly important that you lean into that, because it's not only about your development, but it's not only about their development, it's about your development as well. That's the other thing. One of the reasons, going back to your original question, why I love development, is because I'm a better person. I'm a better leader because I've had to lead other people and develop other people. Because when you're developing other people, you start to see even some of your gaps, some of your flaws. I tell the story a lot of when I first started doing basketball skill training, and probably about 3 months into it, I was like, man, I wish I would have done this when I was in college, because I became a better basketball player when I started training kids, because I had to look at all the small nuance of things that actually helped me get better.
One of the things that I really appreciate is that here we always look inward first, because we believe that leadership flows from the top down. Yep. So even though somebody's growth and somebody's development, that is their responsibility. Yep. They have to accept that is something that they want to do. They have to know where you're trying to take them, and they have to want to go there and actively be a part of the process. And at the same time, the very first thing that we typically do is ask ourselves as a person who is leading somebody else, is there something that I'm doing from hindering this person from being able to understand the process I'm taking them through, or where I'm trying to take them in a way that's hindering their engagement? And I think that is really special. What does it require from, let's say in this moment, we'll call them the student, teacher and the student.
Yep.
What does it require of the student to kind of embrace when somebody gives them power?
I think one is that they have to, first of all, realize about power, that power is never meant to be static. But, I tell people, people say, absolute power corrupts. I don't believe that. I believe what corrupts is static power. When power just sits, when power just stays there, that's when it corrupts, because it was always meant to move. And I think you have to realize that when someone empowers you, that you instantly need to be doing the same thing. You need to be taking the authority, whatever they've given you, and actually go help other people. That's one of the most important things you can do from the beginning. I also think you have to think beyond yourself of realizing that, man, it's not just about your performance, but somebody else has stamped you. So like their name's tied to it as well. So when you're making decisions and you're leading, it's not just about you, it's about other people. So I think a lot of times one of the most important things is when people are being developed is that you've got it, because the focus is on you, but then you have to get your eyes off yourself. Because what we can do is just then like somebody's focused on help you and then we just look at ourselves. You can't do that. You got to as they're focusing on you, then you got to be focusing on other things besides yourself.
Yeah, I think something that I'll add to that comes to my mind is like levels of self-confidence, because I think one of the things that has like hindered me at times is that if I'm given opportunities to like lead, when like I don't believe that I should be in that position, or I don't believe that I'm capable, or I don't believe that I can rise to the occasion for whatever reason, even though I've been entrusted with it, that's what makes me so self-focused. Because then the whole time I'm thinking about, oh, I'm supposed to do this thing. Like, what am I supposed to do? When I do think whenever you change the framework in your mind to, but what about this opportunity is serving other people? It usually kind of lightens it and can help you fixate on the right thing.
Absolutely agree with that.
Another thing I was thinking about from the previous question that we practically use here when it comes to development is character, culture, and competency is kind of our grid. So general character for the organization, what does it look like to embody the culture, and then competency is actual skill. And so it gives this framework so that whenever you are leading somebody, you can think through what are the different areas that they might be really good at, or what might they be lacking. So if we have somebody who's really good at the competency, but they might not embody the culture, like then there is a specific plan in place to help teach them what it's like to be a part of the culture here. And maybe they really embody the culture and we know that they might not have the competency. So what are the things that we're going to put in place to help them rise to the occasion from a skill set standpoint? Yeah,
because I think that what you want to do is when you have those three things, it allows you to then say, okay, here are the boxes, here are their strengths, and also here are their weaknesses. And we believe that, but we start here, characters first, culture second, competencies third for us. And I think because if people have the character, and I think you got to define what that means, okay? Then I think when you understand the culture, you have the cultural values, and like those cultural values are embodied or a desire to embody. That's super important. And then third, the teaching of stuff, because I tell people all the time, most everyone who's grown in something, someone had to teach them how to do it. So I tell people competency is always like the third part of me, but those three grids actually help you a ton.
What's your relationship with power like?
I really try to give it away. Because I know I've seen power just be used and abused and corrupted. And I've seen people like use it in a negative manner. So for me, I always try to tell myself I'm not past anybody. So it's very easy for me to do the same thing that somebody else did. I think so many times we have so much arrogance to think that we're just like, oh no, I would never be like this person. But I always tell people that one person you vilify, you're just one step away from them. And so with power, I really try to work to give it away. At times it's hard. At times like, man, because, for me, I've talked about it so many times on this podcast that like the idea of like self-worship and things like that, to where if I feel like if I give power away, am I losing, am I going to lose something? People, the person I give power to, people like them more than they like me. And so I think I have to just constantly look at that and practice that.
What are some of the fears, you already mentioned them a little bit, that keep you from making room for other people? Yeah,
what I said earlier, just a little minute ago, I think just being forgotten. I think that and I also think that sometimes my value is based off what I do. So if I'm not doing, then what value, even because I'm not doing this, I gave this away, then what value do I have for people? So I think so many times I have to fight those things because naturally I'm like my natural left to myself, I want to keep it. So what I have to really work to do is just, constantly give it away because my natural tendency is going to want to hold it because of what I feel like it gets from other people, which is ultimately like attention and stuff like that.
Do you ever feel like the pressure on a more global, corporate, systemic level when it comes to giving power away. Like, it's not just about that moment with that person, but if you violate it, or even if you do it well, does it ever feel like you're impacting some like grander story and system?
I do. I think that, that's why I think it's important, like when you empower somebody, because if you do empower someone who maybe they don't hold the value of like that, of giving power away and developing others, then what they can do is they can actually use that power to abuse people. I've seen that happen before, to where in good organizations, from the top, and they're leading well, but because, they grew fast, they grew quick, because they're growing fast and quick, they're not properly handing and properly evaluating people and evaluating where they're at. So they'll just give stuff away to people who aren't able to handle that. And what that people will do is there'll be 3 or 4 people removed from you, but they're down there taking power. And with that power, they're lording it over people. They're not giving it away. People hit a glass ceiling with them. So, so when I think about giving away, it's not only about giving it away, but it's making sure people who I'm empowering, that they're evaluating the people they're giving power to, because if not, it can absolutely, I've seen it happen to where it could really, implode. I mean, I almost had that happen here with leading, to where, I think I empowered someone at a time that I don't think that at the end of the day, I shouldn't have. And, it was literally the grace of God that things did not implode, but I could absolutely see, because it does have a bigger impact than just you in that moment.
On an individual level, I think that kind of like giving power away looks a lot more clear. So what does it look like for me as a leader to create opportunities and help develop the person that's underneath me or that I'm leading? What does that look like when you're talking about an entire organization and its relationship with like society?
Well, I think an organization, really good organizations, I read this years ago, is that really good organizations aren't company. They're not just being a company, they have a cause. And I think that companies have a responsibility to impact beyond just the bottom line. So if that's the products you produce, if it's in the communities that you're housed in, and the jobs you produce there, I think as well, the employees that work for you. So I believe that companies have to do this well, because, if they don't, then I just think then what you're doing is that you're just becoming someone who just takes of the resources and don't give. And I think that just makes a negative impact. Now, can you make money and do your thing? Absolutely. But is it going to be what you need it to be long term? I don't believe so. Well, guys, we hope that today was very helpful for you. More than anything else, the one thing I want to leave you with is this idea of make allowance. I think about the time that when I was growing up, my parents gave me an allowance. So I had a certain amount of money that I could spend. So there was an allotted thing that was there. I think that when you're leading people, you have to make room, make allowance for them. You have to build in the room they're going to need. So that's going to be for you as a leader. You're going to have to make sure that you are working on the stuff that you need to do. So like your own personal practices matter. Your own managing of your own emotionality matters. You having margins in your life matter, because if you don't have margins in your life, what will happen? Those things will bleed over. And so when you're leading, you have to make room. You have to have proper perspective, because when you have unmet expectations, that bleeds over. So as you're leading people, what you want to do, and I want you to just think about this week, are you making allowance for them? Is there room for them to grow? And until next time, keep writing new rules.